chegou a hora do nosso amigo americano, radicado na Inglaterra, Dr. Kevin Tipton. Bom dia, meu amigo. Aliás, para você, boa tarde. Muito obrigado por ter aceito o convite, por estar aqui conosco, abrilhantando o evento, e estamos todos agora ansiosos para ouvir a sua palestra.
I didn't understand that.
Many thanks for your participation here in our event, and enjoy, and we are just watching your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let me just make sure I can do this again. Share screen. Is that okay?
Not now.
Uh-oh. Oh, I see. Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, obrigado, for inviting me to speak at this conference, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about what we know currently about fish oil and muscle, and just quickly, I'm Kevin Tipton, as you heard, and I'm the Director of Science and Research for the Institute of Performance Nutrition, and a visiting professor at Liverpool John Moores University. So what I'm going to try to share with you today is what evidence we have for the effectiveness of fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids for building muscle in young, healthy individuals. And we'll talk a little bit about what is the difference maybe in older folks. And I'll talk a little bit about injuries, and there's some evidence suggesting that maybe there's a role for fish oil in injured athletes. And then I'll touch on weight loss a little bit and see what we know about that. So just as a review, just a refresher here, these are the different types of fatty acids, and you see over here the omega-3 fatty acids, and we're mostly going to be talking about the EPA and DHA. And these fatty acids have been used, especially over the last sort of 10, 15 years, quite often as supplements. They're very popular, and so we're just going to try to touch on what actual evidence is there for their efficacy. Now, omega-3 fatty acids, the EPA and DHA, most of the supplements that you're going to get from these fatty fishes, these sort of open water fishes. And you can see that these are where you find quite a bit of these fatty acids in foods. But of course, a lot of people are taking these. Not that many countries, these types of fishes are very popular in the diet. So a lot of people take supplements, of course. So let's talk about omega-3 fatty acids for young active adults and for building muscle. Now, this is probably something a lot of you have seen, and I'm sure Stu will talk more about this later as well. But this is the essential way that we think about building muscle, the metabolic mechanisms here. And we have the amino acids, of course, are synthesized into proteins, and then their proteins are broken down into the amino acids inside a muscle cell. And of course, amino acids are going into and out of the muscle cell as well. Now, these processes, of course, are going on at the same time. They're concurrent and they're constant. They're always happening. And really what you're doing is trying to shift the balance between the two. And so what the main thing that we know with nutrition and exercise is that mostly the emphasis of nutrition and exercise is on the synthetic process more than the breakdown process. So we try to focus on that And so I'll be sharing with you data about protein synthesis and how fish oils might influence that balance between the two, but it's mostly on measuring protein synthesis. So just quickly, again, probably familiar with these data if you followed the literature much over the years, and this is from Stu's lab, and Dan Moore was the first one to show this kind of relationship, a dose-response relationship to the protein. And of course, what you can see is that as you feed protein, you get this more or less linear response up until around 20 grams or so. And then when they went from 20 to 40, there's no statistically significant increase, a very small increase. And so the conclusion from this study, and we did a similar one subsequent to that, but with rest and exercise. Sorry, I meant to say this is after exercise. This is rest and exercise, and Ollie Whittard did that study. And both of these studies came up with more or less the same conclusion, that there's no real big change. You double the amount of protein from 20 to 40, and you don't get any real meaningful response in protein synthesis. So what we want to do with the fish oil here is not actually independently stimulating protein synthesis, but we want to try to, if we look at this as the limit to the response, well, what we want to do is try to break through that and increase that response. So increase the ability of the muscle to utilize the protein that's ingested. And that's the focus of a lot of these studies on whether fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids can help with muscle growth. Now, we do know that this was a study that Chris McGlory did when he was a PhD student with me in Stirling in Scotland. And we know that you can see a measurable increase in the amount of the omega-3 fatty acids in the muscle. So we took muscle biopsies from these individuals when they were taken, and this was around 5 grams of fish oil, and you can see a measurable increase. Now that was associated in this study with an increase in some of these signaling proteins that are the molecular mechanism for muscle protein synthesis and muscle growth. So we didn't measure protein synthesis in this particular study, but I'll talk more about that in a second. So, but we did see this increase that in the omega-3s, and it was associated with these molecular proteins. Now, we don't really know for sure what the optimal dose is or how long it's going to take, because of course that's going to vary. And this study sort of showed us a little bit about that, because in this study, what Sophie did when she was again in Stirling, she fed these guys a high fish oil diet with around 25 grams per day over 6 days. And even in 6 days, you could see a measurable increase in the muscle, in how much of those omega-3 fatty acids get into the muscle of these volunteers. So you can see how with 5 grams, it took almost 4 weeks, and with higher amounts, you can get a lot in very quickly. Now, why am I showing you how much it is in the muscle? Well, I'll talk more about that as we go along, but that seems to be the important factor for how fish oil, the omega-3 fatty acids, are actually working to influence muscle. And you probably know something about this pathway. This is what I was alluding to earlier, that here's the FAK that we measured an increase in, and the P70S6 kinase, and it's through mTOR, are the different acronyms that we use. And that is where we get this pathway to increase protein synthesis. Now, in cells, Stu Gray had this study a few years ago, and it showed that in cells, you get a bigger increase in protein synthesis with the EPA than the DHA. Now, that also was the same when he measured protein breakdown in these cells. So in an in vitro model, in a cell model, it seems like the EPA is a bigger player than the DHA. In humans, one of the first studies to really look at this was Gordon Smith's study, did in St. Louis in the United States. And he was working with Bettina Mittendorfer. And they supplemented fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids for 8 weeks. And then they measured the basal rate of muscle protein synthesis, but also the response to nutrients. Now, what they did in this study was a model that is often used to, have better control in the lab, was they did an infusion of insulin and amino acids to get a hyperinsulinemic, hyperamino acidemic, to try to mimic what might happen with feeding. And you can see that pre-fish oil, you get this increase in muscle protein synthesis when you infuse amino acids and insulin. And that's been shown many, many times, no surprise. But that increase was even greater after the supplementation. Now, notice also something important to notice is that the muscle protein synthesis didn't, on the basal, so resting, no exercise, fasted, no nutrients, was no different. But it was the response that was enhanced. So again, as I said before, you're not really enhancing the rate of protein synthesis per se. You're allowing the muscle to utilize the amino acids more effectively with the fish oil in this case. Now, these were young volunteers. Okay, so that wasn't, it's not the most physiological model. So we thought we'd try to get a better handle on this with exercise. In that model, of course, in the Smith studies, there was no exercise. So Chris McGlory, also part of his PhD when he was in Scotland, what he did was took trained weightlifters and had them in two groups. And one group got 5 grams per day of fish oil, and we went for 8 weeks because we thought we'd mimic the Smith study. And then the control group got the coconut oil as a control, so the same amount over that time. And so then what we did was got the guys in the lab, and they did one-legged exercise. And so you can see there that leg didn't do any exercise and got protein alone. So they had protein after the exercise. That leg did exercise, so that's the protein plus exercise. And we gave 30 grams with the idea that we would give more than enough to stimulate a maximal response. And that probably was important. And there's the exercise amounts. So what he found was, here's the rate of myofibrillar muscle protein synthesis, so the proteins that are mostly involved with muscle growth. And when you see, as you would expect in the fed group, you get an increase in protein synthesis. So this is the group, the leg that didn't exercise. And in the and so they just had protein, 30 grams. And then this leg got the exercise plus the protein, and it's even higher. But there was no really discernible difference between the two supplement groups. So after 8 weeks of supplementation, didn't really do anything. And if you want to see sort of a summary of the change, so this is the change from rest to fed and fed plus exercise, what you're seeing, but no difference between the two, the fish oil or the coconut oil. Now, there are a couple other things I want to point out here because we'll come back to this later. So what you see here is the sort of basal rate of muscle protein synthesis, and that's around 0.25 or so % per hour. Now, if you look at it, if you are familiar with the literature, or if you want to go back and look at the studies, you'll see that this is not uncommon. 0.25, 0.025, or 0.03, somewhere in there is usually the basal rate of muscle protein synthesis in studies of myofibrillar proteins. And here you see about the maximal rate. It's up in this range, up around 0.1. So you see a pretty robust increase. So remember those numbers. We'll try to see if you can remember them because we'll come back to those. Okay, so older adults. What do we know about older adults in fish oil? Well, what we're trying to do, again, is enhance the ability of the muscle to utilize the protein after exercise. And, if you do it, maybe you get it to look like this. And these are the same data that I showed you earlier in the young. And here is a similar study that was done in Stu Phillips' lab in Canada. And you see that there's one major difference here is that as opposed to the young, where there's no real change here, it's very small and not statistically significant, you do see an increase in the older folks when you go from 20 to 40. So it takes more protein to stimulate maximal stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. And this is usually termed anabolic resistance. So the muscle becomes resistant to the anabolic stimulation of the protein and the exercise. And so what we want to see is, does the fish oil, does the omega-3 fatty acids, does that eliminate or at least help mitigate some of that anabolic resistance? Now, again, just as an aside or as an extension, notice here that the maximal response is up around 0.08, so similar to what we saw earlier, and you're not much higher than 0.1 in most of these. If I showed you the error bars, you wouldn't see much higher than 0.1. So again, Gordon Smith did a study in older folks, same as he did before. And what you see, and I'm just going to show you the change now, the difference. So before omega-3 fatty acids, there's the response with this. Remember, this was a clamp, a hyperinsulinemic, hyperaminoacidemic clamp, an infusion. But you see that same kind of pattern in these older individuals, that after 8 weeks of supplementation, that you get a better response to that nutrient intake, infusion. So again, a laboratory model, not as physiological as others. Now here's a study that was done a few years ago at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And this was focused on exercise and the ability of fish oil to enhance the response of exercise in older individuals. So what they did was they measured before and after exercise, and this was around 16 hours after exercise. Now, most studies, when they're measuring post-exercise, they measure it in the first sort of 5 or 6 hours, and that might be important. So keep that in mind. And so you see this increase with exercise. Now, no protein in this situation. This is all fasted, but so this is totally the response to exercise. And so in the old, you get a response, but it's not quite as much. And that's, again, probably that anabolic resistance. But what they did was they supplemented these older folks with fish oil. And you can see that when you do that, you get a dramatic increase in the response to exercise, is what they found. So, of course, everybody gets all excited and says, hey, fish oil are really going to enhance the response to exercise. Now, remember that didn't happen in our study in the young individuals, but maybe it is in this one. But there are a few things to think about here, and that's why I was asking you to think about some of those numbers. First of all, they did share with us the individual responses, and I think that's important. But what you can see here is, remember, we had the basal level, and I pointed out that with myofibrillar muscle protein census, that it was around 0.03, 0.25 to 0.03. Well, here you can see in their study, the basal level in both the young and the old was up closer to 0.1, which is where we saw the maximal response and where most studies see the maximal response. Then if you look at the maximal response, it's around 0.2. Now, we rarely ever, I've never seen anything in all my years of doing these protein census studies. I've never seen that sort of level of myofibrillar muscle protein census. So I think it always makes me think a little bit, something might be a little bit, it questions my interpretation. I don't know what to do with it. And one of the things you can look at here is that if you look at the individual responses, that in the young and the old without the fish oil, most responses are pretty minimal. There's not much going on here. This is the change with exercise. But the average is much higher here. And what you're seeing is that these two in particular are really driving up this average, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the 10 or 11 don't really do much. But these sort of go up a little bit, and then these two go really, really high. And again, a change of that magnitude is just, I've never seen that before. And I'm not, sure how that happened, but that drives this whole response. And so that makes me wonder whether really it's something that a lot of people are going to experience. And so maybe we say that resistance exercise in some older adults might be important. The other thing to point out here is that the triangles here are women and the circles are men. So the three biggest responders are women, and keep that in mind because we'll come back to that. So again, Gordon Smith and Bettina Mittendorfer, they followed up their protein synthesis studies now with a training study or a supplementation study, sorry. So they fed 4 grams per day of fish oil for 6 months to see if they could detect an increase in muscle mass and muscle function. And this is mixed with both males and females. And what you see is that, yes, they did see a response, that when you compared the corn oil to the fish oil, that you're getting a bigger thigh volume, you get an increase in thigh volume, and you get an increase in muscle strength. Now, I'm going to give away the ending here and say that this isn't the most common response when other people have done this. Here's one with fish oil supplementation, and this again was Stu Gray in Glasgow in Scotland. And this time it was 18 weeks of fish oil supplementation, 3 grams per day. And this is with training. So they had them doing resistance training. And here you see strength, muscle strength. And you see, you know, a small but meaningful increase in strength just with the training alone. But when you give the fish oil, that's enhanced in the women. But when you look at the men, it's not the case, that you did get an increase in strength, but it was the same both with and without the fish oil, the omega-3 fatty acids. So it seems like, again, remember in the earlier study, I said that the response seemed to be better in the women, and it looks like that's the case in this particular situation, in this study as well. And we don't know about the Gordon Smith study because they didn't share the division between the two sexes. Here is another one with older females. Now, this time in this study is done in Scandinavia, in Sweden. So they have a higher diet of these types of fishes. But what they did was they increased that diet. And so here's the change in fiber size. So they did muscle biopsies and divided the fibers, type 1, type 2, and they measured the change in fiber size in the muscle. And what you have is 3 conditions here: control, resistance training with 24 weeks, and resistance training plus an increase they fed an increase in the amount of fish that they ate rather than just giving them supplements. And this is in females. So what you can see is you're starting to see something in the type 2 fibers. Training, of course, increases type 2 fiber size, as you would expect in both situations. But when the fish oil was even greater, with less with the type 1, but more with the type 2, and with resistance training, that's probably not terribly surprising. So it looks like when you're adding this oily fish to the diet during this 24 weeks, that you can actually do it with food and not just supplements in women. Now, they didn't test men, we don't know, but if you think about the earlier studies I showed, you'd probably suspect that they might not be as robust in the men. So to sort of sum that up, we can say that the fish oil may have some impact on muscle in older adults, and particularly the evidence suggests that it's probably more so in the women than the men. Okay, so we've got older adults, older women, maybe some impact. Younger adults, we didn't test women in our study, but in younger men anyway, it doesn't seem to enhance the anabolic response, and that's probably because we'd already maximized it. Remember, I said we gave them 30 grams plus exercise, and that probably just maxed out the response. But what about in a different situation? What about in a catabolic situation where muscle mass is lost, such as after injuries? So one way to look at this is not necessarily with muscle size, but with muscle soreness and muscle function. And so a PhD student, again, this was when we were in Sterling, he did a study and he measured muscle soreness and muscle function in footballers, in football players, soccer players, as we say in the US. And what he saw was that when he compared giving fish oil, and this is over 4 days, and so this is the area under the curve for the entire response over the 4 days. So he gave either a carbohydrate supplement during that time, carbohydrate plus protein during that time, or carbohydrate plus protein plus fish oil. And what you can see clearly is that there is a pretty dramatic decrease in muscle soreness during that time. Now, this was one of those models where you do eccentric exercise, and so it's kind of an artificial way to a model to look at it, but it still might give us some indication. Now, Catherine Black in New Zealand sort of did a more realistic applied model with rugby players and in their preseason training. And so she fed either a placebo or fish oil, so fish oil here, or a placebo. And here's the change from baseline. And so this is worse here, of course. It's more soreness is what the negative is. And you can see that with the fish oil that you're actually ameliorating that response over the training time. So there is some evidence anyway that this fish oil may be doing something in the muscle to keep it from being a sore, and hopefully that would then translate into the ability to train harder and not be as bothered. Now, remember I said earlier that it's probably what's happening when you get the fish oil, the omega-3 fatty acids, into the muscle tissue. And so some of Jordan's data sort of support this as well. Again, in the three conditions I talked about earlier, the carbohydrate, protein, and fish oil. What you see here is serum creatine kinase. So when you see increases in this suggests that the muscle membranes are being damaged and that creatine kinase is leaking out of the muscle. And you can see it's much reduced in the fish oil situation. Now, this is serum CRP, cardioreactive protein, which is an indicator of overall systemic body inflammation. And you can see here that the difference between them is not nearly as much, and in fact is not statistically significant. So it might be doing something, but it's not drastic. It's not as much as this. So that suggests that it's a cell membrane related mechanism more than an overall systemic mechanism. And that is consistent with what we saw in some of the earlier data on the muscle anabolism. So one of the things that can happen, of course, when you get injured is you get either reduced activity or even immobilization of a limb. So you get a limb that's put in a cast. And several people, including Stu, who you'll hear about later, but Benoit in this particular study used a casting to show that even as little as 2 days of immobilization, you're seeing a decrease in myofibrillar muscle protein synthesis. You can detect this in just those 2 days. And Sean Kilroe was the first author on that. Now, that translates into, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, that if you put in a cast, if you're immobilized, your limb is immobilized, you lose muscle. And you can measure it in as little as 2 days, and it goes down pretty steadily for the first week or so. And then it's kind of a less of an increase when you double that to 14 days. So it kind of levels off a bit, but you're still losing up to about 7, 8, 9, 10% of your muscle in that time. And I'm sure any of you who have been injured or have worked with injured athletes will recognize that, of course. Now, what can we do about this? Well, there was a rat study done about a decade ago now, a little bit more than that. And they used the hind limb suspension model to cause muscle loss in these rats, and gave either corn oil or fish oil. And you can see that the muscle loss was much less with the fish oil. Now, it was still there, but it ameliorated it. So Chris McGlory, he's now did this work in Canada as his postdoc after he left Scotland. So he's working with Stu again. And you can see that in the yellow, I'm going to show you the placebo, and in the omega-3 fatty acids is the black. And so this was 2 weeks of immobilization, and this was in young women. And you can see here that protein synthesis, again, during those 2 weeks is less. Not quite as dramatic as that muscle loss you saw, but it's there. And then so he also then had these women recover for, boy, I'm going to forget now. I think it's 4 weeks. It might be 2. But anyway, you get the protein synthesis restored back to normal, and it's roughly the same in the two groups. So what does that mean for muscle? Well, here's again the two situations, and this is muscle size, so volume, muscle volume, quadriceps. And you can see that there's a very big difference in the muscle loss, again, with the placebo versus the omega-3 fatty acids, and that the recovery is much better. So what you're really doing here is, because you haven't lost as much, you're gaining, you're not gaining more during this recovery time than here. In fact, I've got this, you can sort of see it this way, but you're actually, because you haven't lost as much, you can recover more quickly. And that's important, of course, if you're thinking about for an athlete. Now, I should say, and this is important, that they were given fish oil, or sorry, omega-3 fatty acids for 4 weeks before they did the 2 weeks of immobilization. So their supplementation started ahead of time. Now, that probably has practical implications. But you can see here, if you put these two together, that the actual increase when you're recovering is not as great. It's actually less in the omega-3 fatty acid. But because you started not as low, you're actually better off. And that's the key. That's what we're talking about here. And that was similar in those rats. In the rats, when after they lost the muscle, when they put them back on to gaining muscle, the fish oil didn't work. So it looks like, again, that's consistent with some of these anabolic situations we talked about earlier. So it seems to be that maybe there's something going on in these muscle loss situations that you can mitigate the muscle loss with the fish oil or the omega-3 fatty acid. Now here we go again with the muscle content, and this was in Chris's study, this more recent one with the supplementation. You can see in those 4 weeks, you get muscle content of the omega-3 fatty acids. Now, what I want to suggest here is that was total muscle, but a recent study also showed that it's not just whole muscle, as you see here in the clear bars. This was done in Canada as well, in Guelph. But what you can see is that also in the mitochondria. So it's not just the whole muscle membrane, but it's the mitochondrial, and even to some extent, at least with DHA, the sarcolemmal membrane. So this omega-3 fatty acids are getting into all these membranes, and we think that's important. And you can see that here. So in a follow-up to, or they also, as well as the muscle loss and muscle protein synthesis, Chris and his colleagues measured mitochondrial function. And so what you're seeing here is the mitochondrial function measured here on the y-axis, and at different concentrations of the substrate, which is ADP. In this, I won't bore you with the details of this this measurement. You can see that once you get up here, that you're seeing with the control now that you're having from pre to 2 weeks to 14 days, that you're seeing a pretty good loss of mitochondrial function at all sorts of different concentrations here. But with the fish oil, it's not. And just to show you a couple, I just circled a couple here, different concentrations. You can see in the fish oil, you're not seeing this drop off. Now, presumably this is due to the change in the membrane amounts of the omega-3 fatty acids. And in fact, Chris and his colleagues postulate in this that it's not that the mitochondrial function is not just important for, which is it is important for athletes to have the best mitochondrial function. Your aerobic capacity is going to be affected, and energy production, but also there's some evidence and suggestion that perhaps the mitochondrial function per se contributes to that muscle loss, and that by preventing a loss of mitochondrial function, you're actually mitigating that muscle loss. And they do a good job in their paper of talking about that. So what we know is that in young women, we can ameliorate the loss of muscle with the casting, with the immobilization. But keep in mind that in a proper injury situation, that you're not going to know, that woman is not going to know when she's going to be injured. So you don't have that 4 weeks. If it is, in fact, what we think, which is that it's how much of that omega-3 gets into the muscle tissue, in particular the membranes, then you need about at least 2 and probably more like 4 weeks for that to happen. So you need to have that prophylactic maybe omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. Now, I do know a lot of athletes do take omega-3s routinely, and maybe that helps, but we don't know. But so the applicability of this is probably a little bit questionable. It's probably even more questionable in men if you think about the data that we have in the older folks, where omega-3 fatty acids seem to work better in women than in men. So with an injury in men, we're not sure how at all that would work. And again, you'd still have to have it ahead of time. Now, one situation that might be effective is if you know you're going to have surgery down the road at some point, you can supplement before the surgery, knowing that after the surgery, you're going to be inactive or immobilized. That might be something to think about. As far as immobilization or inactivity in older men and women, We don't know for sure. It hasn't been directly tested, but it would probably be, you would guess it would be more effective, and especially in the women. So finally, just talk a little bit about energy restriction and what happens with muscle loss. Again, this is a situation that, we were talking about before that is catabolic. In other words, you're losing muscle. And this is just one example that we did, with Sam Metler. And we showed that when you put these guys on 60% of their energy, that you get a lots of fat here. And one group was on high protein, and one group was a control, one sort of normal protein. But the muscle loss is much greater in the control group. But it's common that during a period of heavy energy restriction that you get muscle loss. So the question is, do omega-3 fatty acids, can they help prevent that muscle loss during these energy restriction? And one of the reasons you get muscle loss, excuse me, I've been having sinus problems. I meant to apologize ahead of time. But you get a decrease in muscle protein synthesis, and Stefan Pasiakos showed this, and others have as well. And so that's where you again, can the fish oil then counter that? Can it help keep the decrease from muscle protein synthesis being as great, and then therefore saving muscle during this energy restriction? So Jordan, again, as part of his PhD in Scotland, he sort of simulated or replicated Sam's study from a decade before that, and 60% energy, but this time instead of extra protein, they both got the same amount of protein, but one group got fish oil, so 4 grams per day of fish oil for 6 weeks, and control supplement for 6 weeks ahead of the 2 weeks of energy restricted weight loss. And again, the same black is the fat, and the yellow is the fat-free mass or muscle. And basically nothing, no difference between the two groups. So the fish oil in this situation did not preserve that muscle as we thought it would. Now, this may have to do with how much protein we were feeding them during this time, which was a sort of normal amount. And it might work better with different amounts of protein. We don't know. But anyway, we were just a couple of years ago, we found out. So fish oil may not help with weight loss if you're trying to preserve muscle. And probably what we're thinking is, and this study suggests this, is a study done by Jose Areta and John Hawley, and Stu Phillips was involved, where they measured muscle protein synthesis at energy balance and at rest. And that's what I just showed you before, so that you get a reduction in muscle protein synthesis with energy restriction. But when you give a resistance exercise, when they do exercise, well, you're restoring that protein synthesis now, and even greater with protein, 15 and 30 grams. So in Jordan's study, those guys were training still. I meant to mention that, sorry, that those were trained individuals. They were still training during that 2 weeks. So maybe, again, as we saw in our earlier study with Chris, that when you give the right amount of exercise and protein, that the fish oil can't bump it up anymore. It's already as high as it'll go. And so we don't save the muscle in this situation. Okay, so we think that it doesn't enhance metabolic response to resistance exercise and protein intake in young men, and that's at energy balance or energy deficit. But that maybe in some of these other situations, and this was a nice figure that Chris and them and his colleagues put together for a review paper a couple of years ago. And here's the line of where you're seeing the increase in the EPA and DHA during this supplementation time. And here's some situations where you got the potential utility, and they put this on this continuum here. And so here's about 4 weeks, and you're starting to see muscle disuse, as he saw in these young, at least in the women, that maybe in aging, after 6 to 8 weeks, you're starting to see more, and you're getting this plateau out here. Pre and post surgery, you might need a little bit more time. That's not certain, but then inflammation is probably going to be more important than, remember, inflammation probably wasn't so big here. And then, of course, in the healthy adults, it really wasn't that effective. Okay, so I always have to thank all my colleagues and friends and collaborators, et cetera. And don't worry, I won't try to read them all out. But and thank you, obrigado, very much for your attention to this information.
So, Kevin, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for your participation here with us. And we have 3 questions. The first one, Alexandre asked, which is the best time to use omega-3 concerning strength training? Any time a day, pre-workout or post-workout?
In healthy young individuals, I don't think there's any evidence that suggests that it does anything. I don't think it matters what timing, because doesn't really seem to do anything. Now, we don't know much about women. Maybe it's more effective in women, because in the studies that we did, they were men. And, as I said earlier, in the older women, it seems to be more effective than the older men. So maybe. But yeah, I don't think the evidence supports it in healthy young individuals. In older people, in the studies that have been done, there's no real target as to the timing of it. I don't think that's what's critical, because it's not really an acute effect. It doesn't seem to be. So if you thought maybe it was something to do with reducing inflammation, then maybe you would target a certain time, but it seems to be getting incorporated into the tissue, which takes several weeks. So the time of day that you take it, I don't think is really that critical. In the situations where it does do anything, which with healthy people in strength training, I don't think it does.
Okay, perfect, Kevin. So the second, Roberta asked, why does omega-3 appears to have an age-related trend more effective in others? There is any gender-related difference regarding the absorption effect of that supplementation?
That's a really good question, Roberta. Thank you. The age-related trend, I think, probably has more. I don't think it has quite so much to do with the absorption, because if anything, the absorption is going to be worse in more older people than in young people. There are more digestive issues in older people, but also because we see sort of similar amounts getting into the muscle. So I don't think it's really the absorption so much as what's happening in the muscle. That in older muscle, as I showed you in the one slide, you tend to have that anabolic resistance, that the muscle isn't able to use the protein as effectively as in younger muscle. So that's how, and the one consistency, if you followed through, as I was trying to point out, was that when omega-3 fatty acids seem to be effective, it's in the more the not in the maximal situation such as you get in young people, but in older muscle, the situation's here, and so omega-3 can maybe bump it up. Whereas in younger people, it's already high, so there's nowhere to go. And that seems to be relatively consistent, except for in those weight loss studies. Now, as far as the sex differences, I'm not sure why that's happening. That's interesting, and I think it needs more investigation. We're only sort of just barely getting started with this. That's a great question.
Okay. And the last one, I think, is a very good question asked by Wolf. How does a non-proteogenic element have an ability to reduce muscle atrophy? What are the physiological mechanisms responsible for this protective effect?
Well, as I tried to suggest, that at least some of the evidence is pointing to it's going. The omega-3 fatty acids are changing the membrane dynamics in the muscle membranes. Now, that can work in a couple of different ways. One suggestion is, and it still needs to be teased out, is that FAK is focal adhesion kinase, which is a membrane-bound protein that's involved in the molecular mechanism that leads to muscle protein synthesis. So one idea is that you change the membrane dynamics and you get more of that FAK to be effective and then trigger that molecular mechanism. That's one idea. And of course, we showed that back when Chris did his PhD, that FAK goes up, and Gordon Smith showed in his studies that the increase in muscle protein synthesis was related to an increase in those molecular pathways as well with the omega-3 fatty acids. Now, more recently, there's been the suggestion, and this is from Chris McGlory's more recent studies in the immobilization, that maybe it has something to do with not only just the overall sarcolemma, the muscle membrane, but also the mitochondrial membrane. That maybe because you're actually enhancing the mitochondrial membrane properties, that mitochondrial function is not reduced as it was sort of in the mobilization, that you're maintaining that mitochondrial function. And we know mitochondrial function is less in older folks as well, often. So maybe it has something to do with the mitochondria and the energy production directly that is important. But so it is a really good question, as you said, because we're still trying to figure this out, and these are new studies that are suggesting some of these things. So we still have a ways to go to try to come up with the mechanisms. But that's a very good question.
Yeah. Okay, Kevin, thank you very much for your participation. Your presentation was really fantastic. And stay with us because 1:45 p.m. Brazilian time, of course, we start the round table, okay?
Okay.
And let's see if at the end of this pandemic, we can catch up everybody together.
So can I just say one more thank you to, I know you've got translators who are working very hard, and I'm guessing that I'm not the easiest one. I try to slow down, but I know how hard they work, and they do a great job. So my biggest is it mucho obrigado? Anyway,
yes, perfect Portuguese.
my greatest thanks to the translators as well. I want to make sure they get all the credit for trying to keep up with all my crazy talk.
No problem. You were perfect. And early in the morning, you said bom dia in perfect Portuguese for me. Okay, Kevin. See you.
Okay.
Muito boa a apresentação do Kevin. Kevin é um pesquisador fantástico, fabuloso.